The next presenter is Mr. Ancellino Davis. He will, he will be he will be speaking on party, identity, and environmental politics in the Bahamas, and I have the pleasure of reading out your bio. Okay. So Dr. Davis is an assistant professor of environmental science at UB North. He sits on several national committees and has been involved in terrestrial and marine conservation for the past 23 years in the Bahamas and Caribbean for endangered birds and coral reef communities. He was formerly the senior scientist and policy analyst of the Bahamas National Trust and a director at large for the regional nonprofit Birds Caribbean. He owns the Science and Perspective brand. Dr. Davis chairs the National Technical Committee on Standards for Environmental Protection and Management, co-chairs the Technical Committee on Social Responsibility, and sits on the committees for geospatial standards and artificial intelligence. His geospatial work began with precision agriculture with NASA and the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore in 2005. He has continued with work in the Bahamas, Caribbean, and the USA for the past 2 decades. Dr. Davis is also a practicing artist, using mixed media to create artistic representations of scientific concepts to improve accessibility for the visually impaired and diverse audiences. He has public sculptures in Ohio and has exhibited art in the United States and several Caribbean countries. Please welcome Dr. Ancellino Davis. Thanks.
So as I pull out my extra laptop, because I'm a Boy Scout and I'm prepared, right? But I try to remember my UV password, which is as complicated as they can make it, to protect us against the AI hackers and stuff like that. There you go. Thank you all for joining me. I do love that I got to segue from that AI discussion. I did admittedly use AI for this presentation. The Science and Perspective brand actually owns an AI, and I started in working with AI as I was developing a way for us to find scholarships for Bahamian students actually during my PhD work. But today's topic, I'm actually going to be talking about party, identity, and environmental politics in the Bahamas. In the Bahamian environmental field, environmental laws have progressed significantly. Unfortunately, the politics still lag behind. And that makes it difficult for us to achieve consensus on environmental issues, because instead of us using politics like a baton that we can relay with and everyone is progressing towards the same goal, it's a political football. All right, don't like that AI? That's cool, right? So we have a de facto two-party system, and it's, you know, us versus them. It's their turn now, our turn in the next 5 years. Usually, many people in the Bahamas actually know who they're going to vote for from their parents first told them who they would be voting for. What I'm going to present to you today, I also want to admit to you that it's an incomplete perspective. No map is complete. In geography, we learned that it's impossible for you to make a one-to-one map of anything, because a map of this room that's the size of this room would be useless to anyone who's inside this room, right? So bear with me. I'm not going to tell you the complete story, right? No story is whole, because as you are discussing these stories, they are evolving, especially when it comes to politics and the environment in the Bahamas, right? That's why they call it climate change, because it's going to be different tomorrow. And research never ends. So for those of you who find this interesting or like my delivery, you can follow me on scienceandperspective.com or at SciPerspective, wherever you get your social media. But when we say the story is incomplete, oftentimes as environmental scientists, we're focused on these beautiful birds, the ocean, the water, the sand, but we're not taking into account the economics, the development, the tourism, the tractor that's just outside the image, right? And our focus sometimes makes it difficult for us to involve all the people who need to be involved in these discussions. And in acknowledging that, I want to acknowledge that most of us don't understand these different aspects of what is going on. So what I like to do is make maps. I put things into context, so I show you where you are and where that other thing is. It's something that you want, that you need, that you use every day, or it's something that's going to destroy those things that you want, that you need, that you use every day. And most of the maps in this presentation are going to be static, but like the map that I just clicked on that brought you to this page, many of them actually have very worked out interactive maps that are associated with them. And again, if you follow or visit me on scienceandperspective.com, you will be able to see some of these developments and some of these presentations even as they evolve, and you can even contribute to help build them together. Okay, so this one, for example, is a story map that shows you this is the Bahamas. It shows you that this is where Bahamas Petroleum Company's Perseverance oil well was drilled. It shows you where the Kesal Bank and the east boundary of those exploration wells or that license was. It shows you where the Great Bahama Bank is, the Andros Westside National Park. And these types of images and maps help us to tell the story because we can use this way of distributing it. We can share this with not just other people who are aligned with us, but we can put it out there so that after I give this presentation, all the people who disagree with me can swarm me online and correct me where I'm wrong, right? That's what science is all about, the argument. So we have our maps and our connections. We have our political democracy. So whenever someone talks to me about something related to politics or the law, I said, yeah, is it focused on the constitutional rights that we have? Me personally, if I'm in the Bahamas, I go wherever I want, I do what I want, as long as I'm not taking a right from someone else. That's basically what my constitution gives me the right to do. But we have to understand the legislative process because it ain't always that easy. And sometimes you will run up into someone who does not have the same understanding as you do about what it means to be a citizen of the Bahamas, what the environment is, and all the meanings of the environment and our resources. So we're going to go through some of these things today. I hope some of you get a nice education on it and join me in some of the arguments that we have at the town hall meetings in the future. We have a Westminster system in the Bahamas, so it's a bicameral legislature, but the Governor General actually represents the sovereign. And so you notice that a lot of our politicians, they went from QC to KC. And they didn't move from Queen's College to King's College. They went from being from being representing the Queen and going to represent the King in the way they use the law and legislature. In our House of Assembly, we have 39 elected members of Parliament. By our Constitution, they're supposed to represent equal portions of the Bahamas. And when you talk about geography and mapping, this is where this comes into play. Because we live in the Bahamas, it's an archipelago. We have a bunch of islands flung all over the ocean, right? Some of those islands are bigger than others. Some of those islands are smaller. Some have more people, some have fewer people. So that's why you have some islands are split into parts. You have North Andros, you have South Andros, you have North Eleuthera, Central Eleuthera, South Eleuthera, you have North Abaco, South Abaco, and they might be represented by different people. But then you have a constituency that's named Mikal, which we don't have any islands named Mikal. It's actually a bunch of islands that they lumped together because y'all didn't have enough people for one person to represent in Parliament, right? These MPs serve 5-year terms. And when you think about it, everything happens somewhere and some when. And whenever you see a number of years in voting or election, it's because that's how long your community remembers things, right? That's why around the world, people vote in 4 to 6 year terms. And that also shows you why so many of the environmental issues, it takes about 5 years for the ball to get from one end of the field to the next. This House of Assembly serves as the primary legislative body, and all the finance bills have to originate in this house. So that means when you vote for someone, you need to not just be thinking who gave you a chicken snack this year, but you need to think about someone who could eloquently debate a bill that's related to how the money's going to get into your pocket for the next 5 years. We do have a Senate. The Senate consists of 16 appointed senators. The Prime Minister appoints 9. The opposition leader selects 4 members. 3 senators are appointed after mutual consultation. And these senators, they primarily review legislation. So you have a legislation that might be discussed or argued about inside the House, and then you send that to the Senate, and they're going to discuss this back and forth and work it out because they have experience and understanding. Most of them are lawyers, and they're not going to just understand what that law means now, but they're also going to be putting it into context with what has happened in the Bahamas in the past and what else is going on with the government. Then you have cabinet. So the cabinet is the executive body, and it's collectively responsible to the House of Assembly. If you are a minister of cabinet, you have to support all the cabinet decisions. Many people don't understand the significance of this because a member who's appointed to cabinet, they go inside these private discussions and they're talking about things that will affect you. When they step out of that room, no matter how much arguing they did inside that room, when they leave, they are not allowed to speak against whatever the public decision was that that group made. So you want to make sure that every time you have a cabinet in the Bahamas, you have someone that represents your interests, right? We have a fairly young Ministry of the Environment. So before that, a lot of those cabinet decisions that related to the environment, it was Minister of Agriculture, Minister of Marine Resources had kind of that hat. The Minister of Tourism would be sitting in there and they would be thinking, they would be balancing the value of the environment to tourism versus the damage to the environment from tourism, but not specifically from the tourism side. Those of you that are thinking about gender rights and equality, you also want to think about how do you have a minister in the cabinet who's actively working for that part of your life and your identity as well. The reason you have this collective responsibility is because you want people to continue to have faith in the government, right? You don't want us to see that they disagree or they bicker. But it means that if you disagree and you're a cabinet minister, there's only one way to disagree. It's to leave cabinet. You have to resign. And so this is one of the most telling things that you can have in any political term. And it's also a good way to vote. If you know there was a decision being made and someone left cabinet to speak out against that, you can tell how much that person believed in what they were talking about or what they were fighting against. So for a minister to dissent from cabinet, if they are a cabinet minister, they have to resign. We had a Royal Commission of Inquiry. Anyone in here remember that? And ironically, that means that you do recall. So we had a Royal Commission of Inquiry into scandals around the Pindling administration. And that actually led to 3 cabinet ministers resigning. We have a few other high-profile examples over the years. Minister Earl DeVoe tendered his resignation at one point due to a public outcry surrounding him flying in a helicopter provided by the Aga Khan, who owns Bell Island, where they had a proposal to dredge a marina in the Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park. But before going to view that area that was under that proposal in the helicopter, which was very convenient, they used that helicopter to fly to see a movie in Abaco. And so that became a big thing. He tendered his resignation, but also the Prime Minister doesn't have to accept your letter of resignation. And in that case, he did not accept Minister Earl DeVoe's resignation. You also want to think about the pattern of these administrations. So you have F&M administrations. Hubert Minnis had 2017 to 2021. There were multiple resignations during his time. Brent Simonet had a public land lease controversy. K. Peter Turnquest resigned over loan allegations. Lanisha Roll resigned amid some ministry controversies and the way she was using certain funds in education. A lot of these have to do with scandal, right? So if you're the center of a scandal and people find it difficult to have faith in cabinet, ministers will often step down, resign, and it's better to turn in your resignation than to get kicked out of cabinet as well. But then you also have in our Constitution, you cannot hold certain government offices if you are at the heart of certain things like bankruptcy or major scandals like that that are against the public interest. PLP administration had some resignations. Ryan Pinder resigned in December 2014, but he left for a private sector job. And oftentimes we have ministers, senators, cabinet ministers that go back and forth between public life and private life. And this is also a major consideration that we have to take when we get into these discussions about politics and the environment and who's capitalizing on the natural resources that we also put under their trust. So that was a voluntary cabinet separation, but his resignation was not driven by scandal, and that's kind of unique in our country. This is some information on Minister Earl DeVoe's resignation, which we already went over. Now, we have significant environmental legislation, and there's a rich history around that in the Bahamas. We're often avant-garde as it goes with environmental legislation. And we have key laws that protect and preserve our natural resources, but as they shape environmental policy over time, people are learning new things. The environment is changing, and I'm talking about the natural environment, but then you have the financial and political environments change as well. So all of these things are affecting the regulation, and usually they address pressing concerns. So we're seldom dealing with something that's going to be a problem in the future. We're greasing the squeaky wheel now. This is one of my favorite legislations. I was the senior scientist and policy analyst for the Bahamas National Trust. And so I definitely had to get very intimate with this legislation, as well as the bylaws of the Bahamas National Trust. And then also with how other legislation peeled away parts of Bahamas National Trust Authority so that you could have a forestry department. So you have Department of Marine Resources, but then how the Bahamas National Trust had to be established as an independent organization so that you then have the Bahamas National Trust integrated into other legislations like the Environmental Planning and Protection Act or the Ministry of Environment Act, where they are actually counselors to the government who are separated from the politics in many ways. But it created a framework for environmental policy development in a very particular Bahamian way. When it started off, our Bahamas National Trust actually was charged with protecting the beauty of a country. Imagine being charged with protecting beauty. That's pretty powerful, right? And it depends on how we see beauty, that beauty of our natural environment. We also have this Forestry Act that was established in 2010, and it gives us a framework for sustainable forest management. It protects resources on family islands, and it regulates logging and land clearing now. But they have to evolve over time. Our Forestry Act actually didn't really have enough legislation in place when Hurricane Dorian hit. Who knows what happened to the pine forests in Abaco and Grand Bahama after Hurricane Dorian? Yeah, a lot of people are shaking their heads, sadly, right? I have my good colleagues in the environment inside the room. We lost like 70% of our pine forests on those islands. And now you have what I call the toothpick forest. You drive past and it's just a bunch of dead standing trees. But we actually didn't have legislation in place for people to go in and cut them down right after the hurricane, take advantage of them, make pulp wood or lumber with them, because we hadn't looked forward to that until it happened. All right? We have our Biological Resources and Traditional Knowledge Act. It was established in 2020, and this is an act that actually fulfills an international convention. So the Convention on Biological Diversity, this act actually helps us to support our local Bahamian people and our bush medicine knowledge from being co-opted, colonized, and stolen by others internationally. And so those of you who think the environment is one thing and social responsibility is something else, or the politics of international agreements and trade are different from the environment, it's not, at least not in our legislative arena. It governs genetic and biological resources, and it also addresses intellectual property and research. At this time, I would like to state that nothing in this presentation is formal research under a permit by the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection. I do consider my ability to talk about what happens in the Bahamas, especially politics, as a part of my customary and traditional behavior and activities. And inside the Biological Resources and Traditional Knowledge Act, that's actually excluded from any permitting process. So as long as you're talking to people about how you're going to vote and how the politicians do this and that, I think that's our culture in the Bahamas, right? If you want to share your bush medicine recipe with your family, or if you want to treat your child, they can't come after you for that, okay? So knowing these laws sometimes gives you a way to make sure that you protect who you are and your identity from infringement. The Environmental Planning and Protection Act was established in 2019, and it replaced a lot of older laws. And what it did was it consolidated a lot of these issues that we had in the Bahamas. And Mr. Clark, in his talk about AI, spoke about how we could use AI to bring in all this disparate information from all over the place and consolidate it and help us to make proper decisions. This act helped us to do some of that, and it addressed having a permit under the Department of Marine Resources, another permit under Forestry, another permit under the Bahamas National Trust, and now all of them have to go through one system, which then tells you that you have to get a permit from the Department of Marine Resources, another permit from the Department of Agriculture, a permit from the Bahamas National Trust. And honestly, it makes it a lot more difficult now. And if you've been watching the newspapers, you would have seen a lot of scientists, both internal and external, have had a lot to say about the failures in the process, the difficulties in getting UB students or any Bahamian the ability to do research in our own country. And it has become a challenge. This is special because it mandates environmental impact assessments, and it mandates certificates of environmental clearance for developments. But like every Bahamian legislation, it identifies who's in charge, who gets this authority. It tells you what they have authority over and what's illegal to do, what you need a permit to do, and how much it costs. Then it gives that person the permission to tell you that, oh, that's fine, you don't need to do it. This can cause a problem in many cases. When you have a development that goes in and maybe they're not required to submit an environmental impact assessment by the authority, but everyone in the community says, why isn't there an environmental impact assessment? You have a mandate on that legislation that says the director should make to be published your environmental impact assessment, but it doesn't prescribe how. So you might have a business that is going to establish Fancy Key Resort in Abaco, but then for you to find the environmental impact assessment, you have to go to the Chub Key Abaco Impact Assessment because that's the name of the island. And so their advertising, their tourism advertising is divorced from the environmental impact assessment and what you need as a citizen to pair these two things together. So when they say they're gonna have 300 rooms, or they say they only gonna have 30 rooms, and it's so environmentally friendly because it has a small footprint, you can then compare that to the environmental impact assessment that says it's only gonna have 30 rooms, but it's gonna have 50 rooms for the hotel staff that live there. And those are different things when you have a tourist from North America looking at it, and you have a local Bahamian environmentalist, conservationist, or a fisherman who's going to use the creek right there. We have some agreements, some international agreements like the Caribbean Challenge. And this is a 2008 regional political commitment where we said we would conserve 20% of marine environments by 2020. And it guides creation of a lot of marine protected areas. The interesting thing is no policy or practice around the world applies fully in the Bahamas. So even in our region, when we committed to this 20%, we never made that by 2020 because what does 20% mean? Right? And my 20% to your 20%, in Jamaica, you walked, 20 feet off the island, you are in deep, deep water. In the Bahamas, in Andros, you could walk out for half a mile and you still only up to your knees, right? And our fishermen use those areas differently. Our natural resources use those areas differently. So all of this changes when you bring these policy decisions home into the country. And so as we do this, as we discuss these things, different government roles have different responsibilities. You have your Minister of Finance, and they're controlling your national budget. They're allocating funds for resilience projects. They're dictating financial terms for foreign direct investment. So all those discussions and stuff that go on, at the end of the day, when they're making a decision based on money, it comes down to the Minister of the Environment. What political position usually is paired with the Minister of Finance? Anyone? The Prime Minister of the Bahamas. So it stands to reason that they must feel that that's a very important ministry. If they believe that it's so important that it's worth the Prime Minister of the Bahamas sitting in that position as well. And it's also important to acknowledge that it's so covetous that despite the fact that this is a huge ministry with lots of touch points on different areas, they don't respect it enough that they want the Minister of Finance to be independent from them and able to make the best financial decisions, right? So you want to think about the person and the identity in each of these situations where your Prime Minister is also the Minister of Finance. Because the Prime Minister, regardless, he's going to be in cabinet. He will always be in that room. So when he designates the Minister of Finance, he can choose that to be someone else and still be involved in the decision. So when he makes that decision to make himself also Minister of Finance, that changes the dynamic. You have an agricultural minister who manages coastal and agricultural land use, regulates fisheries stocks and marine resources, and issues licenses for fishing operations. And they promote sustainable agricultural practices in some cases. You have the Ministry of Tourism, and they attract and approve resort developments. And this could be your little hotels, but mostly the Minister of Tourism is going to be involved very publicly in these large-scale developments that severely impact the environment. The Attorney General. The Attorney General is one of the positions in the cabinet who's almost always not an elected Minister of Parliament. So what that means is in your community, you hardly ever vote for your Attorney General. Because the Attorney General, you want a lawyer with significant expertise in the Bahamas, and they are often someone from the Senate that you then call in to be your Attorney General. And sometimes they can hold a political role as MP, but that hasn't been the case all the time. And this is the person who's going to defend the government in litigation. So when you have the government makes a deal and breaks a deal, this is the person who's going to be called as one of those defendants inside that case. You also have some other government roles that we're going to talk about. You have the Director of the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection. They're appointed to oversee major development projects, and they monitor compliance with the Environmental Planning and Protection Act. They're the ones who are supposed to make sure that your EIA is published. They're the ones who are going to sign off on your research permits and stuff like that. And they manage that EIA and CEC process. They can also actually tell you to do research. So this is a discussion that we need to have, because you have these ministers who can actually delegate authority, responsibility, and dictate your ability. So that means if there was the will, the Director of Environmental Planning and Protection could say, University of the Bahamas, we only have 20 employees in the department. We need y'all to go out and collect environmental data. We need you to go out and collect biodiversity data. We need you at the Antiquities, Monuments, and Museums Corporation to go and collect the information on our historical artifacts, right? We need you in our Ministry of Culture to collect information on our bush medicine and how it's applied in the Bahamas. Technically, they can tell you to do that. And so this is something that you want to take into account when you have these discussions with a person who's in that position, and especially when you see that they are maybe not meeting the goals of their mandate and you have something to offer. You have your Director of Marine Resources, who manages national marine protected areas, enforces fisheries regulations, oversees marine resource conservation, and regulates sustainable fishing practices. Now, one thing about these directors is they're not a minister, right? They're not going to be in that cabinet discussion. So although they might have some of this authority, and the Director of Department of Environmental Planning and Protection, for example, is actually appointed by the Governor General. So she has a separate line of reporting. This gives you a situation where you have these technical professionals and experts in the field who are directing the day-to-day activities and hold a lot of the authority in the department and a lot of the relationship power. But you seldom see them in the newspaper, all right? The Prime Minister heads the cabinet, as I said before. Attorney General is the chief legal advisor. The Minister of Finance controls the budget, and the other ministers manage their specific portfolios. We had our Minister of Environment, Earl DeVoe, and he served from 2007 to 2012. That was F&M. PLP came in 2012 to 2017. That's Kenra Dorset. Then you have Romy Ferreira from 2017 to 2020. Until recently, Minister Vaughn Miller, may he rest in peace, was the Minister of the Environment for this political term under the PLP again. If you don't have agreement and a goal for the entire country, each of these switches back and forth may change what they're thinking about. And you can see around this table, different people are thinking about different issues related to the environment. As I said before, if you'd like to contribute or access some of the information and data that Science and Perspective collects, this is one of the tables that I have. And this just tracks who is our minister, who's in these key portfolios over time. And this here, I isolated down to finance and tourism, because tourism is tourism and investment now, right? And that's in this term, you have the Minister Chester Cooper is the Minister of Tourism, Investments, and Aviation. And so when you look at anything flying into our airspace, like spaceships from SpaceX, he's the one who's making decisions on that, right? When you have big investments coming into the country, he's making decisions on that. Our ministers of finance throughout history have been affecting that. And then we have our ministers of agriculture, fisheries, and the environment. And again, you can see we have a short history of environment ministers, but we have a long history of agriculture, fisheries, and marine resources. And also you have where agriculture is tied to so many other things. fisheries and local government, because the family islands have a lot of agriculture and fishing going on. Agriculture, trade, and industry, because we have a lot of fisheries and agricultural elements that go into international markets. And so we want to think about those things. So I want to bring you back now to some specific examples. And you have, for example, our COVID-19 response. That was nationwide. That got paired with Hurricane Dorian. And so you had a national level impact. All the ministers were pulled in. You had a new ministry was developed. So you have a whole new ministry of disaster preparedness, management, and reconstruction. And that's under the minister administration. After the F&M lost, they changed the name of that ministry. They changed it. They brought in some other elements. National Emergency Management Agency got pulled into the Disaster Reconstruction Authority, and they made the Disaster Resilience and Management Act. But this is in 2022. Now the Prime Minister actually sits as at the head of that committee, and almost every cabinet minister is a part of that committee when they go into disaster response mode. But it's still called a subcommittee of the cabinet. But this is one of those situations where the law does a lot to change the names of things, change the way it interacts at that high level. But at the end of the day, we still don't have a hurricane shelter in Abaco. We still don't have a lot of the schools repaired in Grand Bahama. And we still don't have a working airport that's fully functional in Grand Bahama, right? So these are things where you think about these policy decisions, and as right-thinking Bahamians, we're now gonna look back and who's making the decision when and how it impacts what's going on with us. We had the Equinor oil spill in 2019, and so that was paired with Hurricane Dorian, and you would expect that groups that were engaged in previous oil spill activities would be mobilized for this. You have these points create really amazing unity in the Bahamas, because we can all post on social media about 3 birds and 1 goat, right? But from the environmental sector, what that meant to me was that you did not have the government consult with leading local scientists about the diversity of birds in Grand Bahama. We have more than 300 species of birds visit Grand Bahama every year. We are not just talking about birds and agricultural animals like goats. We're also talking about the plant life there. We're talking about the fish. We also got a quote from the minister that said, no wetlands were affected. Almost immediately after I heard that, anytime you say a piece of the environment to me, I'm building a map in my brain. So when you say no wetlands were affected, I'm gonna go and look at this area, and I will draw a line around where the oil went. And I'll look at this area, this wetland here, that's inside that area, and I say, nah, I think someone got something wrong, right? You look at where they did their remediation. So if you're driving on this highway here, from the road, you can see about that far. And so that area was bulldozed. So all the oiled trees that you could see from that highway were cleared down. But the oil that goes further wasn't taken care of. But we didn't have baseline data, so we can't really say what was where. Was there oil there? Was there not? But afterwards, we collected samples years later, but there was still oil in these wetland areas, in these sample locations, and you can actually see that in the State of the Environment Report by the Bahamas National Trust, which is freely available online if you'd like. But it's actually free for you to go online and map these things yourselves. These were the estimates, 119,000, or maybe it's just 55,000 barrels of oil. Their numbers changed because the government didn't know how much oil they had, and the company didn't know how much oil they had before the storm. So then they had to go and measure it afterwards. And so that's why these numbers change. They said 3 birds and 1 goat, but like I said, there were no environmental teams that went out to monitor. They did flyovers and they got some local reports. It's very difficult for you to identify a bird from a plane. I mean, I'm just saying that personally. And maybe they had other experts on there. These are some of the tables from the BNT Post-Dorian report. You have up to 151,000 milligrams per kilogram of soil. This is like 2 years later. And 9.3 milligrams per liter in the water. And y'all know how closely our surface water interacts with our groundwater. For the most part, our groundwater is within 3 feet of the surface that we walk on. So that's what we're dealing with. And it's still ongoing in Grand Bahama. So come up and visit. Don't drink the water. You have Bahamas Petroleum Company that finally started drilling in 2020. And there was a big hubbub about it. But the issue is, for me, is that the Bahamas Petroleum Company actually registered in the Bahamas in 2005. They got their first licenses from Prime Minister Perry Christie in 2007. It's just that it took them almost a decade and a half to get to where they have their permissions. Some things that I find interesting is that Davis & Co. were their legal representative. Davis & Co. is the law offices of our Prime Minister. From 2011 to 2021, Minister JoBeth Colby Davis was their legal counsel. It has an overlap with 2017 to 2021 when she was also a sitting senator. So when you're talking about developing our Oil and Petroleum Act legislation, and you have someone in the Senate developing that, that becomes a little bit challenging. But it makes it understandable when Minister Romy Ferreira and Minister Hubert Minnis say that it was impossible to get out of that contract. You couldn't stop it. Minister Ferreira is quoted as saying it was one of the worst arrangements in the history of oil exploration. As we go through the work and stuff that they presented, we also have quotes from the minister saying that everything went according to plan on their drilling, their exploratory drilling. But then Simon Potter, when he is discussing his drilling activities with oil industry professionals, he just mentioned offhand, oh yeah, a piece of metal fell down the well while we were drilling it, but no big deal. That don't sound like that's cool to me. That don't sound like that's kosher. And you didn't hear, or you don't see on this slide, any of the ministers from Andros, because they were not vocal about their dissent in this public discourse around the area around Andros and the West Side National Park and all of those fisheries resources, right? You want boiled fish, not oil fish for your breakfast, right? And crab is a key element of our culture, but those crab they come through that environment. This oil exploration continued, and it went through, although we had a lot of local opposition, we have this very intimate relationship between Prime Minister Christie, Prime Minister Davis, and Minister JoBeth Colby Davis with Bahamas Petroleum Company. And then a lot of the signing of their leases and stuff happened just before or just around election time. And so these also create considerations for how we understand what happens in voting and politics. And this is even after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. That is still ongoing. So you mightn't hear about it in the news, but this is 15 years later and those people still haven't recovered. So I think that's my time. Oh, we have a little bit more. Okay, thank you. The North Andros mining project I wanted to point out as well, and these maps are mine based on that project, but this is important because the BNT actually spoke out against this, even though one of the members of their executive council was a major proponent of this mining operation. And here at the same time, you had a meeting by Minister Leonardo Lightbourne that got superheated in Andros, where people were for the jobs and other people were against the damage to the environment. Minister Chester Cooper ultimately is the Minister of Investments now, who the Bahamas Investment Authority nixed it in 2022. But you have the Chamber of Commerce president was advocating for the project. And right after they nixed that project, you had the Minister of the Environment and the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection actually had to do investigations on that island for illegal mining. So it's a lot of cool political intrigue. Well, not cool, interesting. But if you want to hear more or learn more, please feel free to join me, follow me, and get my contact information afterwards. And yeah, these are some of the other spicy stuff that I was going to talk about. But yeah, thank you very much. I'm open to questions. I hope I balance the poking the bears on both sides.
Hi, Dr. Davis. Great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think it's really important to sort of make the point that don't let the politicians get off the hook when they tell us that their hands have tied because they've licensed certain oil drilling operations. They may be bound in contract as members of the executive, but they also sit in parliament as parliamentarians, and they can ban operations as MPs. And so I think it's important to sort of, I would like to hear your comment about that in terms of how the separation of powers doctrine sort of affirms that position, that banning can be done by persons who wear two hats in Parliament.
And so definitely our Constitution actually says that whoever's representing you in Parliament must represent you when you voted them in there, right? And so you as a constituent of Andros need to be educated as to how your family and your history and your culture ties into the conch, the bonefish, the crab, because if there's an oil spill, your family is going to be dealing with that. And the symbol for crab is cancer, but that's not what we want to get from our crab when we eat it, right? And so you want to be able to advocate within your community and take them to the politicians and say, no, you're representing us. There's going to be no oil drilling in Andros, for example. At the same time, I do think that there's a lot of politicians who are riding a party line as well. We have some good examples of people who cross the floor, and some who have certain belief systems that they think something is right, and maybe you vote for them for that reason. But yes, I definitely believe that each politician has that ability, and then they also know what the deal actually says, what the lease agreement says, and they're mostly lawyers, so they could figure their way out around that, I think, if they had the will.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Davis, for this presentation. I had a question about these slides and if they will be available. Would you put them on your website, or is there a way for the public to access this information?
Yes, if you go to any of my social media and you message that social media, that's going to come directly to me. So at Sci Perspective throughout. And once you message that, if you are interested in different topics related to science, you can ask and I'll publish it. Some things I often publish in restricted access, not to prevent public knowledge, but so that I know who is accessing it, right? And that allows me to keep track of where the message is getting. So also don't feel like you're denied by that, but I just want to know how well the message is getting out there.
Any other questions? Raise your hand. Good morning, Dr. Davis. My question is regarding the conflict that it seems that I would say in the political sphere where a good example of it would be that we designate an area as a national park, a fall track, for example, and then we turn around and decide to build a hospital there, and then have the audacity to tout climate change and also carbon credit, etc. Can you speak to that seemingly conflict?
The same thing that I said at the beginning of my presentation, no story is complete, no map is representative of the whole, right? Most politicians have very little understanding of the environment in the way that you and I would. Everyone, this is Mr. Christophe Francois. He's an environmental professional as well as a student here at the university. When they make those decisions, we do not have a very good hand-off performance. And in every Olympic game, the ones who drop the baton will lose it, will lose the race, right? And this is what's happening. You have the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection, the Bahamas National Geospatial Information Systems Center. They're regularly losing information or data between terms. And so you think about that, but also most politicians don't have that same interest. So when you have a Minister of Health is in the conversation in Papal Tract, and they're looking for a hospital, especially after Hurricane Dorian and COVID, the environment is going to take a back seat. So you can acknowledge them as people, as representative of their constituents and constituencies. And I know Papal Tract is a beautiful area, but it doesn't rank very highly right now, unfortunately. That's how I perceive it.
Any other questions? I have one, and I apologize for moving around. You said something. What is the penalty? Are you aware of what the penalty is? For instance, when a cruise ship is found to have dumped its waste in our waters. So do we have a system of fines and penalties now?
They are diverse and varied. So you have, there's the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. So there are penalties related to how you treat and operate within the marine resources of a country's exclusive economic zone or their territorial seas. There's also our national level regulations. And so when a cruise ship comes into a certain distance, they're not allowed to discharge and stuff like that. At the same time, we actually take on the burden in our heads of agreement with a lot of these cruise ships that, hey, you don't have to flush your toilets near us. We'll actually empty your toilet for you, right? So there's a lot of post-colonialism and servitude that's built into our tourism product as well. So sometimes they don't have to do that. But also there's a lack of accountability because we don't do a lot of tracking. So you're not a criminal until you get caught, right? And so a lot of times the dumping and the waste, it doesn't show up until now. We have social media where you can have someone document it. If any of you take anything away from this presentation, when you're filming that person doing something in the environment, say who you are, say where you are, say what the date is, say why you are recording what's happening and who you want to do something about it. And we don't get the penalties because people don't do that. But we have different fines.
Our resources track or trying to track down poachers. We're not actually monitoring cruise ships that could be polluting on a daily basis.
We have,
This frame, is that a way to frame? Because that's what we focus on in terms of our resources. Poaching and drug dealers and illegal immigrants. But not multinational pollution.
And that's because that's how it's framed in the political arena, and that's the culture that most politicians are building in to their constituents. You put one group for the Haitians, one group against the Haitians, and then you have a Haitian vote and a Bahamian vote. Or you put one group for the environment, one group for progress, and you don't ever allow them to merge. And so you get those difficulties as well. Thank you.
Yeah, well, okay, one last one.
Okay,
Comment or question?
Question. Appreciate you allowing me to ask.
thank you.
The Traditional Indigenous Knowledge Act.
Yes, Biological Resources and Traditional
Biological-
Knowledge Act.
Awesome. How does that play out in terms of protecting the medicinals, like the bush medicine? You mentioned it, but I'm trying to figure out in my mind because other countries have soursop. So what exactly is the protection? How does that work?
Within the Bahamas, that law cannot stop you from distributing your materials and using that within the country. The convention that it actually supports actually states that they're also not supposed to restrict you being able to market it internationally. So the research and stuff that goes into it. And as a bush tea professional, for example, if you're testing your bush tea in country and making it better and better, it should not prevent you doing that as part of your normal market research, as opposed to making you get a permit for developing your bush teas. That's what the letter of the law says. But the way the policy is applied can sometimes be difficult, and it's most often challenging to the regular person who's trying to navigate that. But we can talk about it more, and I do have all those laws and policies actually within the Science and Perspective environment so that people can access it even when the government websites are down. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.